Tiny feet were once considered a sexual fetish, a mark of beauty, a status symbol, and a passport to a good marriage and a better life. However, having such tiny feet came at a devastating cost. Young girls endured the excruciating practice of foot binding, during which their feet were tightly wrapped, broken, and deformed to meet the standard of perfection. For centuries, young girls in ancient China were subjected to an extremely painful and lifelong debilitating procedure called foot binding. Their feet were tightly bound with cloth strips, with the toes bent downward under the sole, and the foot was tied front to back so that it grew into an exaggerated high curve. The ideal adult female foot would be only 3 to 4 inches in length. These tiny deformed feet were known as golden lotus feet. The practice of foot binding is believed to have been inspired by Yao Niang, a court dancer from the 10th century who tightly bound her feet into the shape of a crescent moon to captivate Emperor Li Yu of the southern Tang dynasty. She performed on her toes, which were wrapped in a 6-foot golden lotus adorned with precious stones and ribbons. The emperor was deeply enamored with the dancer's beautiful, tiny feet. Upper-class women, hoping to attract the attention of the emperor themselves, starting binding their own feet to make them smaller. Over time, foot binding evolved from an aristocratic trend into a deeply ingrained cultural practice across various social classes. The process of foot binding was lengthy and excruciating. A foot binding ceremony was usually performed on girls between the ages of 4 and 6. At that age, bones are still composed of pre-bone cartilage and were easier to break and mold. Richer families usually preferred to have a professional foot binder, since they would be less likely to be moved by the girl's cries than her mother or a relative. This was a real concern, as failing to bind the feet properly the first time would mean that it needed to be done again. And the process was so horrifyingly painful that it's hard to imagine that a relative could bear to do it themselves. But in families that couldn't afford a professional, they often did. First, the feet were soaked in a mixture of animal blood and herbs that was thought to soften the feet and make them easier to bind. After being bathed, the toenails were cut back as far as possible to stop them from growing into the skin after the binding. Then, the toes were pushed down and twisted into the bottom of the feet, shattering the bones. The loosened bones were then squeezed together as tightly as possible and bound up with cloth. Once the cloth was wrapped tightly, it was sewn together to prevent the girl from trying to loosen it. Over the next few months, the feet would be broken and rebound at least a few times a week, keeping the bones from healing back into their natural position. As the feet began to swell with blood, the toenails and skin of the toes would begin to die, and the binder often had to bathe the feet in a solution that was designed to dissolve the dead flesh. The standard of perfection for a woman's feet was the golden lotus, measuring 3 inches in length. A 4-inch foot was referred to as the silver lotus, while feet longer than 5 inches were dismissed as iron lotuses. The process was also extremely dangerous for the girl's health. The toenails frequently grew back into the swollen flesh of the feet, which led to horrible infections. In addition, the lack of circulation in the feet often caused gangrene, but this was actually seen as a benefit. The gangrene would cause the toes to rot and eventually fall off the feet, making them even smaller. Sometimes the binders put shards of broken glass up against the cloth in order to deliberately introduce infections and cause the toes to fall off. If these infections spread to the bloodstream, as they often did, then the girl was at risk of dying from septic shock. Unsurprisingly, around 10% of girls subjected to foot binding died as a result of sepsis, and the process usually resulted in lifelong health problems for those who survived. The folds of the feet often attracted fungal infections, and observers stated that the bound feet often smelt terrible when the bindings were removed. It often took years for the bones in the feet to heal, and girls risked breaking them while walking until they were well into adulthood. As the girls grew into old age, the difficulty of balancing on bound feet made them more likely to fall and break their hips. So why would anyone do it? In ancient Chinese society, beauty standards were heavily influenced by Confucian ideals and patriarchal norms. The bound foot was seen as the epitome of feminine beauty and grace. Women with small feet were thought to embody refinement, elegance, and submissiveness, qualities highly valued in the rigidly hierarchical and male-dominated culture of the time. The aesthetic appeal of bound feet was romanticized in literature, art, and poetry, where they were depicted as delicate, alluring, and a mark of high status. Beyond physical beauty, bound feet also symbolized a woman's moral and virtuous qualities. The excruciating process of foot binding, which began as early as ages 4 to 6, demonstrated a girl's ability to endure pain and sacrifice, virtues seen as desirable in a wife. Foot binding was closely tied to marriage, serving as a critical determinant of a woman's marital prospects. In many regions of China, bound feet were a prerequisite for a desirable match, particularly among the elite. Families often used their daughters' bound feet as leverage to secure advantageous marriages, ensuring alliances with wealthier or higher status families. Women with unbound feet were often deemed unsuitable for marriage, relegated to lives of labor and poverty. The practice also had implications for social mobility. For lower-class families, binding a daughter's feet was an investment in her future, increasing her chances of marrying into a wealthier household. Bound feet also offered an air of mystery. Because the feet were tightly bound, the only time someone would see a woman's feet were in the bedroom. In the same way that seeing a Victorian woman's ankles were considered scandalous and even erotic, men in China fantasized about seeing women's bare feet. Bare feet were never depicted in art, even when the subject was painted nude. In many ways, the feet were considered the most intimate part of the body. The allure of the feet was in the fact that men never really saw them. The mystery made the feet an object of taboo speculation and desire. In fact, bound feet were considered so erotic that a Qing dynasty sex manual lists 48 different ways to incorporate them into lovemaking. Even the foul smell caused by fungal infections in the folds of the feet was appealing to some men. And others argued that the folds somehow stimulated the growth of folds in the vagina and increased the thickness of the hips, making lovemaking more pleasurable when your partner had bound feet. Bound feet had such erotic appeal that the size of a woman's feet was even judged and separated into categories. Foot binding also symbolized a family's wealth and social status, particularly among wealthier urban households. It served as a display of privilege, demonstrating that their daughters were not required to work or engage in any labor. Conversely, poorer families often avoided the practice, as their daughters needed unbound feet to perform physical tasks and contribute to household survival. Obviously, a woman with bound feet would find it hard to make a living outside of the home. Not only would it be hard to work, but the physical difficulty of walking away from home meant that women with bound feet would find it hard to even leave in the first place. Thus, foot binding may have been a way to ensure that women depended on their family to survive and were unable to leave the house until their father arranged a marriage for them. Once in a new household, they would then be dependent on their husband and his family. For men, a woman with bound feet was attractive for marriage, not just because the feet themselves were erotic, but because they knew the woman would be obedient as a wife. Of course, the truth is that a number of different factors probably played some role in the popularity of foot binding. It was a way to seem more feminine, desirable, and civilized. And it was also a sign of obedience and commitment to the traditional Confucian ideal of sacrifice for the sake of your family. And in many ways, women saw the pain of foot binding as the cost they needed to pay for beauty and social standing. Whatever the reason, Chinese foot binding probably persisted for more than 1,000 years, a reminder of how much society can sometimes expect women to suffer for beauty.